Welcome to Close Encounters from beautiful Stalheim in Voss. My name is Karin Hinsbo and I'm the director of the National Museum. I'm currently standing on the site where Johan Dahl painted the artwork we are looking closely at today, the iconic From Stalheim. The painting itself is also here at the Stalheim Hotel just down the road. We brought it here, back to where it was painted, and yesterday it was on display for the public to see. This summer, the National Museum is bringing highlights from our collection to places all over Norway. Go to our website and follow us on social media to find out when we will be near you. There you can also find out when our next Close Encounters will be. This web series where we take a closer look at works in the museum's collection. Now I'll pass you over to curator Øystein Ystvedt and paintings conservator Thierry Ford for a close encounter with From Stalheim. Enjoy!
Welcome to Stalheim Hotel. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to ask them in the comment section below and they will be asked to Øystein and Thierry after the talk. Over to you.
Hello there and welcome to this close encounter, focusing a very interesting painting in the collection of the National Museum. Johan Dahl's painting From Stalheim from 1842. We are actually sitting here in front of the painting, but the situation here is rather extraordinary as we have the view in the painting just in front of us on the other side. We are at Stalheim Hotel, and on the other side is the Nære Valley, which is depicted in Dahl's painting here. I think we better start with having a careful look at the painting and point out some interesting things. Firstly, I will comment on the huge scale of the painting. It's a huge painting, one of the largest paintings we have from Norway from the 19th century. It's almost 2.3 meters, and it's a landscape, as we can see, with mountains, a valley, and it's rather dramatic. It's a bit dark, gloomy. Maybe it's a change of weather going on. There is a sense of drama here, very much due to the weather situation and the diagonals in the composition that makes this atmosphere. And there is a lot of details in this painting. Here we have a settlement, and maybe another further inside. And there are several paths around, and waterfalls, and smoky areas. And there are also people on their way around in the painting, some on horseback, other ones walking. And here, in the foreground, we have a shepherd with his flock, and here in the foreground, a birch tree. So there's a lot of things going on here. Starting in front of such a painting, I often start asking myself, how was this painting possible? How did the artist make it? What was his equipment, his or her equipment? How did he do it? And Thierry, you are a painting conservator, taking care of our paintings and study them very carefully in this respect. So you must be the perfect man to ask such a question. So how did Dahl accomplish such a painting?
Yeah, no, so that's a really interesting question, Øystein. And what we know is that this painting was actually, it wasn't executed up here, obviously, but it was painted in his studio in Dresden in 1842. So it's signed and dated, as you can see, in the bottom center of the painting. But what we also know is that Dahl had been here earlier in 1826 and again in 1834, and there survives quite a large sketch which is very similar to the composition here, and probably taken also up from the viewpoint that you saw earlier, where the director introduced the program here. And there also survives two other sketches that they're more in line with smaller sketchbooks that he would have had on his travels. So I think these were definitely sort of aide-memoirs for the artist when he traveled back to Dresden and started working on this piece. But it was interesting what you said about the sheer size of the painting. I mean, you've got to remember this painting is from 1840, and at that time, just weaving large canvases. I mean, the canvas is about 196 by 246. So looms were weaving at that time 2 meters, rolls of about 10 meters. So this was obviously some important commission. It was costly. And these sizes were, if you correct me if I'm not wrong, Øystein, they were more reserved for sort of royal portraits or history paintings.
But getting back to this sketch versus studio painting, how did Dahl actually transfer the image from his sketch until up to the studio painting?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So the composition. Yeah. So he, from what I can see, and from what I've looked at the painting closely under the microscope, but also I've been using a technique that we use quite commonly when we look at paintings called infrared reflectography. And basically we use infrared, which is the longer waves of the spectrum beyond the visible light. So actually it's quite nice here because you have the rainbow. So it's basically the infrared is everything beyond the red that you can't see. And we use that to penetrate through the paint layers. And if you have, like in this case, you have a light-colored ground, so the light is reflected back. But if it's absorbed by a drawing, like made with a carbon-based pigment or medium, then we will be able to see the underdrawing. And that we can see, I think you're seeing now, we can see infrared images of the settlement and also of the horse and the travellers in the bottom left-hand corner. Difficult to see without the trained eye, but what I get from this is that he actually, it's a very well-planned composition. There is no indication of alterations, and that's usually what we're looking for. We're looking to see whether the artist has changed anything. So Dahl had, definitely sort of worked out this composition. And another thing that's really interesting, and we know this from earlier research on Dahl, with another painting that's in our collection from 1826, which is the view from his studies in Italy, in I think the view from Castellamare. And we know that with the larger studio works, Dahl seems to have painted in sections. So he worked quite quickly. He was a very talented, very able artist, and very much at ease. So he would work in sort of giornate, so different days, and let the paint dry. So, and I think it's quite quickly executed actually, because he's so skilled. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think his contemporaries were actually quite jealous of that fact. They didn't quite like the fact that he was so quick and had this talent.
No, it was absolutely part of his artistic output that he had an easy hand with things, and to me that's something that we can see out of his painting, that he makes it very easily, and it's not overdone so much, and this emphasis, this easiness emphasis, the immediate thing.
Yeah, the sort of, and his manipulation of the paint as well is quite spectacular. But I wanted to ask you, Øystein, why, because you actually work more with 20th century art at the National Museum. So what's your interest in this 19th century painting and Dahl?
Yeah.
You can,
I think we will have to go back to the sheer size of the painting. It's a huge painting and the scale of things. As I mentioned, it's one of the largest paintings in 19th century Norway. And it's quite special that it's just a landscape. There's nothing really going on here. There's no really event. I mean...
Oh, but what about the rainbow?
What about the rainbow? Of course, when we do have guiding tours and asking kids, it's very fun to ask that question. What's going on here? And there are several answers, and then suddenly the rainbow comes along, and then it's about the rainbow. But in fact, the rainbow is very far from the center of the painting, and well, could be the rainbow, but it's not obvious main motive. And to me, this is an example of a painting that do have a lot of motives that goes along with each other and not really a main theme. And that's slightly different from most old masters paintings that most often do have a central core in the composition. Here is not really... I mean, if you ask 10 people, you might have 10 different answers to what's going on here. I mean, there's no bridal couple, there are no burial, there's no really great event apart from the weather situation. And that's, to me, a very modern thing. And this combined with the huge size of the painting, that underlines a very important thing with Dahl, that he kind of gives nature importance. That nature is something important in itself. It's not important for a story or for adventure or something. It's something that has value on its own. And to me, that's a modern thing. That's a modern view on nature and landscape, that it has a value on its own. And it can be beautiful without man's cultivating of it. Because this is rather barren and very raw and rough nature. It's not the beautiful landscape as
But it's spectacular. I mean, we're sitting here, and I mean, this is the first time I've been here, and it is. I mean, it's understandable why he captured this scene in a way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Today,
yeah.
It's obvious. Yeah. But at the time of Dahl, it wasn't that obvious. At the time of Dahl, the beauty of nature was very much more related to men's cultivating of nature. That nature had to be cultivated, had to be into something that man-made. So this is something new with Dahl and some of his contemporaries, that nature in itself is something worth paying attention. But I also have to mention that Dahl has a kind of almost scientific approach to things. He goes very deeply into observation and nature study, and this closeness to things, I think, also is very important. And for example, the rainbow, how he has made that rainbow, that's not a fantasy thing, that's something observed. He does it very evenly, correctly, the right, correct spectrum of colors, red on top and violet on bottom. This is something observed. And I think that attitude to what's going on. That
Yeah,
important.
and also what was interesting, we heard also from the local staff that run the hotel here, and that this is a phenomenon that happens quite frequently, the rainbow. Yeah.
I have no. I'm absolutely sure that Dahl saw this rainbow.
Yeah.
He was, in fact, very concerned about rainbows because he used that motive in several paintings very early in life, and it goes through almost his whole career. But we saw a rainbow here a few days ago, so it's obviously something to do with the weather situation here in this area that makes that kind of
And
phenomenon
also quite
possible.
appropriate with the pride.
Perfect pride thing.
Anyway, but yeah.
But having mentioned this rainbow, there were a comment made by a scientist in the 1930s, that said that it was almost impossible to have combined this rainbow with the shadow of the settlement. You know, the shadow of the settlement in the middle of the painting. That means that the sun comes from this side, and it's something with the angles that don't really make sense. But the point is that information came along long after Dahl. That was kind of knowledge that came after mid-19th century. So I'm pretty sure that if he had had that knowledge, he had corrected in this painting, because he was very concerned about detail and correctness and be part of his time. But Thierry,
Yes.
sitting here, and we have to jump to another issue related to this emphasis on observation and nature study. Dahl is very close to these things. And you mentioned that this painting is very well planned, very well organized, and so on. But Dahl is also famous for his small outdoor sketches and open-air paintings, we might call them, which is basically made in front of the motif, outdoors. Could you tell us a little bit about that technique?
Yeah, so, I mean, what's quite interesting, we, at the National Museum, we actually have a very nice collection of Dahl paintings. I think about, I'll have to check, but I think about 140 or more. And we have a lot of his oil sketches, which are also interesting. And what you mentioned about, you know, the beginning of the 19th century was this interest, you know, in sort of science and the natural sciences and things, and going back to nature. And I think this is quite interesting as well, because there is sort of a vogue throughout Europe of artists really sort of going outside and wanting to record nature, like Dahl. So he was very much in tune with that sort of movement that had really sort of started in I mean, artists had always been painting outside, but there was, especially in France and England, you know, artists travelling down to Italy, and they would then make these small sort of sketches to capture the tones and the colours, and so these sketches would be done very quickly. And the thing, what's quite interesting, I mean, you can just see it in the landscape. I mean, moving around Norway at that time was actually quite difficult, you know. So you imagine, you know, they didn't really have the equipment that we have today, and especially at the 1840s, this was sort of painting outside was quite a sort of a new experience. And paints were actually Dahl's painting in oil was still in pig splatters. You know, so they would dry quite quickly. So, you know, that's probably also why these sort of...
So he had to work fast then?
He had to work fast. It's not really until the 1840s that which is the same date as his painting, that you start to get what we know of paint tubes, you know, these collapsible tubes, and they really, you know, they were expensive. So that's probably why he made a lot of these sketches. But in a way, I think it's also interesting that his technique is also, he uses a lot of that technique actually is transferred to the studio work.
That makes sense to me as well, because as I see it, something of the freshness of Dahl's studio paintings comes from that kind of activities. I mean, they are quite different, the way they are executed and the way of doing it. But it seemed to me that he takes some of the experiences and the experiment from his small outdoor sketches and transfer it into his large-scale oil studio paintings. And it's to do with color and brushstrokes and attitude that you get this fresh feeling of nature.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree. And I think, you know, this, I mean, I don't know actually, but I mean, I presume this would have been, you know, painted in the winter months, and then his travels were in the summer, or, you know, so when it was possible to travel. But that made me think actually, Øystein, why? Because Dahl was actually in, what is now known as Germany, but he was in Dresden. He had been across the Alps down to Italy. We saw that painting before. Why come back to Norway? Why? He had left Norway a long time ago. Why? What was the sudden interest in Norway? Maybe you can...
That comes very early on. Dahls developed an ambition to depict and make landscape from his home country. During his career, he made 5 ambitious study journeys in Norway. He lived in Dresden, and basically he went from the eastern part, Halden and Christiania, and went over to the western part.
So Christiania was Oslo, as we know it.
Yeah. So, but on these travels, study journeys, he made these sketches and drawings that he used when he got back to his studio, and used as a backdrop and a guiding line for his studio paintings. So, from very early on, he is very concerned about his home country. And I think it's interesting that he used phrases like home country and fatherland. He doesn't really mention Norway so much. It's more, and to me, these phrases mean something with something he is familiar with. It's the landscape and its nature that he's grown up with. It's his fatherland or home country. So there is a longing for getting back and make a painting of his home country. But why Norway to such an extent? That's a good question. I mean, this painting, for example, is so embedded into the history of Norway. I mean, for example, the first sketch was made in 1826, the 29th of July, that's Olsokaften.
Oh, yeah, so yeah, it's dated. Yes,
a holy day in the history of Norway. And the painting was made in the same year as the National Gallery first opened its door for public, and so on. It was commissioned by Grevedel Jarlsberg, who was a very important member of the Eidsvollmen. I mean, we have to take, for our foreigners, we have to take a short history of Norway, because Norway was, for a long period, part of Denmark, until 1814, due to the Napoleonic Wars and the Treaty of Kiel, it was handed over to Sweden. But in the interim period, short interim period, we got our own constitution and the parliament, and that gave rise to a strong national identity thing throughout the 19th century. And Dahl is, of course, very much part of that. And this painting, when Grevedel Jarlsberg asked Dahl to do this painting, is, of course, part of this wish to build up an independent art tradition and independent art institution in Norway. And just to conclude this, this painting was all, in the end, given to the National Gallery in 1914, in the 100-year anniversary year. So it's really a painting that is very much part of this Norwegian history. So, but we need to talk a little bit more about this painting, about the painting technique in terms of color. How did he really manage to capture the landscape here?
Yeah, so, I mean, like I mentioned before, I mean, Dahl is quite traditional. I mean, he's painting in oil. He's a traditional artist, trained sort of traditionally in a way. What's kind of interesting is that he's, I think I mentioned it before, he's using, in this case, he uses a light grey ground, so the priming layer. He uses also coloured grounds in other paintings. And I think he's been using this really to get the sort of cool tones in the sky, and then in the foreground he uses sort of more sort of brown, sort of umbers and ochres colours to build up a sort of half tones, like sort of like an ébauche, to give also those darker tones. So that's what I can sort of see, sort of understand from his paint technique. But coming back to the ground, what he seems to do, he also chooses a very finely woven canvas, and now we know that this was, an important commission. So this was an expensive piece of canvas, and the ground layer, so the first layer would be primering layer, was very smooth. And I think Dahl is actually interested. He's not really interested in the texture of the support, so the canvas. He's more interested in the texture of the paint, and that's very interesting. And another thing, I mean, his palette is quite limited, but typical of the time. It's sort of, it has the lead white, the vermilion or cinnabar, the mercury sulfide for the reds, and the earth colours, the ochres, ultramarine, probably in the sky, and he also uses Berlin blue, which is actually Prussian blue. It comes under different names. So a limited palette. Interestingly, he doesn't use a lot of greens, which is surprising. So he's really mixing up the greens with blues and yellows, the same with browns, so that's kind of interesting.
It seemed to me that he's very much part of the academic tradition.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
He works within and follow the academic tradition, but he does it very well.
Yes,
and he's very familiar with it, and he really develops. And I mean, early on, he studied the old masters very carefully, and he has that way of doing it in the bottom of things.
Yeah, so he is skilled at drawing. It's easy for him to then transfer this, over to canvas. He's not using, like we saw with the infrared. I wish I could have got a whole scan of the infrared, but that will be for next time. But we see, so there's a very planned. So there's a lot of talent there, but what I find particularly interesting with Dahl is, and I think this is something that he's well known for, is his rendering of of trees and foliage. And this is something I'd like to check out, but it seems to me, especially in these areas here, there's a lot of leaves and foliage, I'm wondering if he's been using something called McGilp, or sometimes known as gumption. And basically, at the beginning of the 19th century, also late 18th century, there was this experimentation with different mediums with oil, and artists would add. We find this in treatises. They would add like a resin with a drying oil, and then something called sugar of lead, which is lead acetate, which would help dry, and it would shake it up, and it would sort of create a kind of jelly consistency, and then they would mix that with the paint, and it would enable them to sort of get that sort of, give that sort of texture and sort of that sort of feeling of the foliage of the trees. And I think this is something. I mean, this is something that it would be nice to actually look closer at when we've opened and we have a bit more time.
Absolutely, and also because Dahl is such a great painter of trees. As you said, there is something going on when Dahl paints trees, especially birch trees. That's his speciality. You can even see in here in this broken birch tree in the foreground that there is a sensuality when it comes to Dahl's way of doing birch trees. And I think he really enjoyed that part of his repertoire. And not without reason, without reason, the other iconic painting by Dahl is this large-scale painting of a birch tree in storm, which is in the collection of the Code Art Museum in Bergen. So I quite agree with you. That will be good to have a further search into.
But yeah, no, I was thinking, but Dahl as a person, what do we know about him? I mean, yeah.
Indeed, it will be good to have some idea about his as a person as well. Because Dahl lived quite a life with several ups and downs. To begin with, he came from ordinary conditions, son of a fisherman or a boatman in Bergen. He had a large family, many siblings, and had some relatives connected to Ytre Sogn. And I want to mention that because Ytre Sogn is not so far from here, actually. It's another part of the western part of Norway, but it does have a nature and landscape that's kind of similar to this landscape here at Stalheim. So there's something where it comes from that seems to be interesting. He was obviously talented. It was a question of having an academic education, but he started to work as a decorative painter in Bergen. But he was then discovered by a school teacher in Bergen, Lyder Sagen. And Lyder Sagen, he managed to collect financial support to get him abroad for an education within the arts. So at age 22, he left Bergen and his family to study at the academy in Copenhagen. And he was not to return to his hometown and family until 15 years later. And when he do that, he's a hugely successful artist, already a professor in landscape painting at the academy in Dresden, in northern Germany. So it's quite a career. He married twice. He got several children, but both his wives died in childbirth, and several of his children died very early in life. There's a lot of tragedy in life. One of his sons, Sigvald, he survived and eventually became a painter himself. And Sigvald also became a very important contributor to his father's legacy. So when this painting from Stalheim was in the making in Dahl's studio, he was in fact, had in fact become a bit embittered man. He was hugely successful, but it was a new generation of artists at that time who went in other direction than his rather demanding realist style with huge emphasis on observation and nature study and so on. But I think it was other reason for his embitterment. After his first study journey in 1826, as you mentioned in the beginning, Terry, Dahl became very engaged in taking greater care of things from the past. That means old buildings and memorials and so on. And during the years and during these study journeys from time to time, he realized that most of these wooden churches from the Middle Ages, for example, they were either turned down or they were in severely bad condition. So he was deeply involved in establishing and developing things in his home country, starting museums and art institutions, National Gallery, art councils, a National Trust for Norway, and so on. And in the 1840s, he was very much involved in the restoration of the Håkonshallen in Bergen and in the care of the stave churches around the countryside. But the thing is, he did not really get any serious response on these things, not from the king, nor the parliament, or any well-to-do citizen. So he ended up by even buying a stave church himself to ensure its continuing existence. That is Vang, which later was placed in Germany, actually, because he didn't get any solution in Norway. So he experienced how difficult it was to carry out these things. And to me, this late large-scale studio composition, as this from Stalheim, is very much part of this growing concern for our national heritage. He may not have succeeded in every regard on his own lifetime, but the impact of his engagement is rather overwhelming. It's very much due to him that we, after all, we do have some stave churches from the Middle Ages left in this country, and in a pretty good condition as well. So, but as an artist, he very much kept his status as the father of Norwegian painting. But to me, we rather call him one of the major artists of the 19th century Romantic movement in Europe. So that's a short biography thing.
Yeah, but you yourself, you quite prefer the sort of finished large-scale studio works to his sort of sketches? Or
Actually, I prefer everything by Dahl. I'm a huge fan of Dahl, and I quite like almost everything he's done. But there has been a tendency to put more and more emphasis on his small oil sketches and so on, and that's because they obviously point out to 20th century art and open-air paintings and modernism, and that's fine. But to me, it's something with his large studio paintings, that's where his really radical new view on nature manifests itself. So to me, those are a bit more radical and more important than the oil sketches. So I would like to fight a bit for them as well.
Yes.
But Thierry, let's get back to this particular painting. As a painting conservator, and the situation here today, how was it for this large painting to travel up here from Oslo?
Oh yeah, that's a difficult one. No, of course. I mean, the painting is nearly 200 years old, and I mean, obviously, it's fragile, but it's stable. And obviously, the advantage today is that we're not travelling like Dahl did. You know, we still have to travel over the mountains from Oslo, but we have better roads and better trucks and things like that. But here, I think this is kind of a unique sort of one-off experience, because I mean, this painting has been loaned to some galleries, but not very often. But it's the first time it's actually come here in situ. So this is just a fantastic opportunity. And I think it's also, like the director mentioned, it's important that this, this was made for Norway and for his, what he called his homeland, this part of Norway. But obviously, what's been great with this is that we've had a special crate made, so the painting actually has a different frame, so we've taken it out of the frame, and it's also protected by glass. So we've taken all the precautions. But perhaps you want to say something about where it will hang in 2022 when we open, because then I guess it will go back into its original frame. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
But first, I like to say that I really appreciate your pragmatic openness toward a situation like this, because it is great, from a curator point of view, it's great from time to time to go outside the box, outside the museum, and for a new situation, because a new situation like this, then you view the artwork differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
You get a context that makes you aware of things in quite another way than within the museum.
Yeah.
I won't say we will do this all the time, but I really appreciate
But
that.
I like that, because it's in a way it's outside of the box, but in a box. So there was a nice compromise there. Yeah,
absolutely. No, we have, of course, been thinking very seriously about how this painting will be presented in the new National Museum. And it was obvious that it should be part of the presentation of the collection. This painting has been more or less on the wall since it came to the National Gallery in 1914, part of the Romantic period. And at Vestbanen, due to open 11th of June 2022, it will be in room 43, together with other examples from the Romantic period. It will be the major masterpieces within that room. And yeah, we look very much forward to welcome you to this new building and a reunion with this painting, of course. By now, I think we are more or less ready for some questions, perhaps.
Yeah. Can I quickly get one in? Is
Sure.
that okay? Yeah.
Sure.
I hope that's okay. No, I was what I was interested in when I was looking at the painting with infrared. I looked at the signature, and sometimes Dahl signs I.C. Dahl instead of J.C. Dahl, and I just wondered if there was, a reason behind that.
We often get that question, and unfortunately we don't have a strict answer, but we do have some theories. One theory is how he signed his painting. He combined the first letter of his first name with his last name. So that means the J went into the D. And it could be wrong read as ID. That's one theory. I'm not totally convinced with that one, but it could be. But the other one is that the Norwegian language in 19th century, Danish-Norwegian language, the I and the J were mixed up often.
Sort of like interchangeable, yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that could be a reason. But at some point, it got almost into a standard to give information, I.C. Dahl. But we don't really know how that came about.
There's something else to look into.
So,
Yes, we have some questions. We have one question. If you know anything about what time of the day it was painted?
I can do that one. I have been wondering that myself, and luckily this time we have a very strict answer. It's made in the afternoon, around 9 o'clock. That means the sketch is made at that time, because Dahl signed it very carefully, pointing out the date and the time of the day. But the rainbow is there in the sketch as well, and all the main feature is included in the sketch and in the painting. So I think we could conclude that it's an afternoon situation.
Yeah, because there's a clue in the rainbow as well, isn't there?
Yeah, I think there might be. And I think from what I've understood, I could be wrong, but I think, rainbows don't really occur or don't occur at midday. So it's either definitely morning or I think probably more likely in the evening.
Yeah. Let's see if we have another one. Do we know anything about why Dahl went to Stalheim in the first place? Ellisiv is asking this question.
Dahl followed the post road. This was a post road from east to west, and where they have several stops where you could sleep over and go further next day. And that was for very rough condition, very humble things, shattered things. But and Dahl also makes comments about how badly things are in between. But basically they followed this post road. And there were artists that went before him. And he got some tip and advice where to go. And Stalheim was said to be a very spectacular view.
And it is.
It is.
This one is probably more to you, Thierry. Is it possible to know what kind of brushes Dahl used?
Yeah, that's a good question. They would have been. I think he's using quite small brushes. Can't remember exactly, but I think it's before you get these ferrule brushes, which with metal. So if I remember rightly. So quite small brushes. But I mean, I think actually maybe we can see in the portrait of Dahl painting at his easel in his studio, painted by his son Sigvald. Maybe we can. That's a good question. Maybe we could see, or maybe not. I can't really see from here, but maybe you can see on your screen. But he's using a maul stick, so his technique was quite precise. Yeah.
Which most artists did at that time, I suppose. That was kind of a standard.
Then we have two quite similar questions about the influence of Caspar David Friedrich on Dahl, because they were friends.
Sorry?
Caspar David Friedrich,
yeah.
His influence on Dahl.
They were friends and colleagues living in the same house in Dresden.
But the influence of Friedrich on Dahl was...
I think it was both ways. They had huge respect for each other, but they were hugely different, very different kind of artists, and very different way of making a painting, almost opposites. So it's a very interesting contrast.
And then we have the last question of today from Åshild. Being in situ, to what extent did Dahl alter the motif in order to balance the composition? Has anything changed compared to when you see it here?
Should I? No. I've got to try. I mean, I went up where the director introduced the session today, and it's very similar, and I agree, and that's where the larger sketch is from. But there are some, I mean, he's moved around a bit, but I think you mentioned it, he is very true to... Am I right in saying that you said to me before something about where you can always recognize the
We do have a discussion going on where exactly the spot is, because there are some strangeness. For example, the Jordalsnuten, the blunt mountaintop, is much lower in Dahl's painting than it actually is from this viewpoint. So there's one thing, but in general, Dahl is very close to this large drawing in the Code Museum. And it seems to me that Dahl made most of the editing before he made the drawing. That he worked with different solutions and decided the exact outline. and composition, and then he drew. Because when he made the drawing, then he followed that, kept to that.
Yeah, and we don't know. I mean, there's 3 that we know of that survived, 3 drawings, but I mean, there probably would have been more. But I think I completely agree that the main one, which is in the Bergen Museum, is what
but I think he developed a very good way of concentrating the characteristic of a place. And that is very much to do where he comes from what we call prospectmaleri in Norwegian. I don't know if you call it prospect painting in English, but it's basically painting do very evenly, very neutral painting of places, Bergen, harbor. That part of his time in the decoration painter.
Oh, as a decorative painter. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Well, thank you both for answering some questions. And I think we're going to go outside for a moment, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for watching. The next episode in the series of Close Encounters will be towards the end of August. We wish you all a great summer.